Good day, and thank you for the opportunity to present my work. This paper focused on multicultural families in South Korea and more specifically on how children of marriage migrants develop a sense of belonging in family life. Over the past 2 decades, international marriage have become a stable part of South Korea's demographic structure and an important focus of both policy and research. As a result, multicultural families have become a key site for studying integration, social reproductions, and intergenerational change. In this field, children of marriage migrants have received growing attention, especially in relation to education, identity, and social integration. Language plays a central role in these discussions, and it's often seen as a key indicator of integration and ethnic identity. This view is based on a simple idea that better Korean language skills lead to successful integration and stable belonging. However, this idea becomes problematic when we look at empirical cases. Even in families with similar structural conditions, children develop very different trajectories of belonging. Some are fully embedded in Korean-speaking environment, while others show more complex or unstable forms of attachment. These differences cannot be explained by language proficiency alone. This leads to a central question. If language is not a reliable predictor, how is belonging actually produced in family life? This paper addressed this question by shifting the analytical focus from language as an indicator to language as a regulated practice in family interaction. Rather than seeing language as a measurable outcomes, such as proficiency, use, or loss, I treat it as a domain of decision-making and everyday practice. This shift makes it possible to examine not only what languages children speak, but also how language use is actively organized in the family, how it changes over time, and how children respond to these practices. Let me now briefly explain the empirical basis of this study and the analytical approach. The analysis is based on qualitative biographical interviews when post-Soviet marriage migrant women in South Korea. The dataset includes 10 cases, 5 of which are longitudinal, combining interview conducted in 2013 with follow-up interviews in 2025 and 2026. This longitudinal design is central to the analysis. It allows us to trace how initial conditions, maternal expectations, and language practices change over more than a decade and how early decisions affect later outcomes. Participants were recruited using positive and snowball sampling, sought personal, academic, and community networks. They come from post-Soviet context, including Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, and have long-term residence in South Korea. I focus on post-Soviet migrants not because they are seen as fundamentally different, but because they allow me to observe variation across family trajectories. This helps me examine belonging outside standard frameworks, centered only on structural disadvantages or linguistic deficit. Interviews were conducted in Russian and lasted between about 16 and 2 hours. They focused on migration trajectories, marriage formation, everyday family practices, language use in the household, and mothers' perceptions of their children's belonging. All interviews were recorded and transcribed. The analysis combines cross-case comparison with case-oriented interpretation. At the first stage, all 10 cases were analyzed using thematic coding, focusing on pattern of language use, maternal strategies, and children roles in family and social context. At the second stage, for the purpose of this paper, I use a focused analytical strategy by selecting two contrasting cases. These cases are not intended to be representative. Instead, they are selected to isolate the mechanism under study. By comparing cases that differ in the logic of language regulation, one formed mainly by structural constraints and the other by deliberate maternal strategy. The analysis show how different configurations lead to outcomes that are not fully controllable. This approach follows a qualitative analytical logic aimed at identifying mechanisms rather than producing generalizable findings. In this framework, language is understood as a regulated practice built around three interrelated elements. First, maternal decision making. Mothers actively organize language use by prioritizing, restricting, or excluding particular linguistic practices in response to their own experience and expectations. Second, children's response. Children do not passively reproduce these strategies but engage selectively, which introduced variation in outcomes. Third, time. Language practices are formed sequences of decisions over time, and early configuration often constrain later possibilities. Together, these elements form a mechanism through which belonging is produced as an ongoing, non-linear process. The first case illustrates how language regulation emerges under conditions of structural constraints. Mirela migrated from Uzbekistan with higher education and prior professional experience. Upon arrival in South Korea, however, her everyday life was structured by sole residence in her husband's extended family. This environment was organized hierarchically, and her position in it was defined by both gender and limited language ability. Her limited proficiency in Korean significantly restricted her communication and autonomy. As she recalled, she was unable to perform even basic tasks independently, stating that she couldn't even explain simple things. This experience reflects not only a language barrier, but a broader condition of dependency in family structure. In this context, Korean became a dominant language of interaction, while Russian was progressively excluded from communication with her children. Importantly, this was not a deliberate decision. Instead, it was a situational adjustment to the linguistic norm of the household and to Mirella's constrained position in it. Language use in this period can therefore be understood as externally regulated by structural conditions rather than internally driven by maternal strategy. A significant shift occurred when Mirella moved out of the extended household. This transition altered her position in the family and enabled greater autonomy in organizing everyday practices. In this new context, she began to reintroduce Russian in communication with her children, both through direct interaction and through participation in Russian-speaking social networks, including church community. However, this reintroduction didn't lead to stable bilingual practices. Also, children develop partial comprehension and occasional use. Russian didn't become a consistently used language in everyday interaction. Its presence remained fragmented and context-dependent. This outcome highlights the layered nature over time of language practices. Earlier, limits didn't simply disappear, but continued to shape later possibilities. The reintroduction of Russian didn't reverse earlier pattern, but operated under limits established during the initial phase. Mirella's case thus demonstrates that language regulation is contingent, path-dependent, and only partially controllable. It shows how structural constraint can initiate a process that later attempt at reorganization cannot fully reverse. Look at the second case. The second case presents a contrasting configuration in which language regulation takes the form of a deliberate strategy. Elena migrated from Russia after more than 20 years of life and professional experience in Moscow. In contrast to Mirella, her early experience in South Korea were not structured by extended family so-resident, but were still marked by strong linguistic dependency. Despite having basic communicative ability, she experienced significant limitation in expressing complex thoughts and leading with difficult or emotional situations. She describes these conditions as a loss of autonomy, stating that she could speak but couldn't say anything serious, and that she was like a child. This experience played a central role in shaping her later approach to language. Over time, as her Korean improved, through everyday interaction, especially through school-related networks, she was able to reposition herself within both family and institutional context. However, instead of changing her approach to language, this experience strengthened her view of language as necessary for independence. Drawing directly on her own experience, Elena adopted a deliberate and consistent strategy of excluding Russian from everyday communication with her children. As she explains, only Korean. They don't feel what I felt. Korean was therefore framed not simply as the dominant language, but as a protective strategy for her children's future. This strategy was implemented consistently from an early stage. Communication in the household was conducted exclusively in Korean, and no systematic effort was made to keep Russian. Unlike in Mirella case, where a language use shifted gradually, here exclusion was established early and maintained over time. In the short term, the strategy appeared successful. The children were fully part of Korean-speaking environments, showed strong language skills, and didn't experience the limitation that shapes their mother's early years. However, over time, Elena began to rethink this decision. Reflecting on its longer-term consequences, she links the lack of Russian in her children's lives to her earlier choice, stating that they don't know Russian at all. That's my fault. Attempts to reintroduce Russian at a later stage were largely unsuccessful. The language remained limited and didn't become a functional resource. This case illustrates the temporal asymmetry of language regulation. Early exclusion creates conditions that constrain later possibilities even when maternal intention change. It shows that deliberate strategies, no less than structurally imposed ones, produce outcomes that are not fully controllable. The comparison of these two cases allows us to move beyond individual trajectories and to specify the mechanism that shows how language specifies the mechanisms that show how language operates in multicultural family. Three analytical points can be seen from this comparison. First, language regulation may take fundamentally different form. Look at this. In Mirella case, it appears as a response to structural constraints, particularly those linked to hierarchical family organization and limited communicative autonomy. In Elena case, by contrast, language regulation is a deliberate and future-oriented strategy based on maternal experience. However, and this is crucial, this different logic don't result in different level of control over outcomes. In both cases, maternal intentions, whether formed under constraints or by strategic decisions, don't translate into stable linguistic practices or predictable trajectories of belonging. This suggests that language cannot be understood as a domain fully controlled by parental agency. Second, the temporal dimension is central to understanding the process. In Mirella's case, early restriction of Russian within the extended family continues to affect later possibilities, limiting the effectiveness of later attempts at reintroduction. In Elena case, early exclusion creates a different but equally constraining effect, making later recovery of the language difficult or impossible. This indicates that language practices are path-dependent. However, they are not cumulative in a straightforward sense. Instead, they create conditions that influence future trajectories without fully determining them. This temporal asymmetry is particularly important. It shows that early decisions, whether imposed or intentional, have long-term consequences that are not easily reversible. Third, children responses play a key role in mediating this process. In both cases, children don't passively reproduce maternal strategies. Instead, they engage selectively with the linguistic environment structured around them. This selective engagement explains why similar strategies may lead to different outcomes and why language don't function as a reliable predictor of belonging. Taken together, this observation challenge approaches that see language as an independent variable linked directly to integration or identity. While previous research has demonstrated correlations between linguistic competence and institutional incorporation, the cases presented here show that such correlation don't explain how belonging is produced in the family. Language doesn't operate as a stable resource with predictable effect. Instead, it functions as a domain of practice within relational and temporal dynamics. At the same time, this analysis extends existing scholarship on marriage migration and gendered family practices. While it's well established that migrant mothers actively organize family life under conditions of constraint. The cases discussed here demonstrate that maternal agency alone doesn't determine outcomes. Instead, outcomes result from the interaction between maternal strategies, children responses, and changing family conditions over time. Finally, this finding contribute to theoretical discussions of belonging. While processual approaches have conceptualized belonging as relational and dynamic, they often remain at a high level of abstraction. The analysis presented here specifies the mechanism that show how belonging is produced in the family, showing how it develops in everyday interaction, structured by language practices. To conclude, this paper argues that language should be understood not as an indicator of integration or ethnic identity, but as a regulated practice in family interaction. By shifting the focus in this way, we can explain variation in children trajectories of belonging that cannot be explained by structural factors or language skills alone. The analysis show that language use in the family is actively organized by mothers' decisions. But this practice don't produce stable or predictable outcomes. Children engage with these practices selectively, and their responses introduce variation that cannot be reduced to parents' intentions. At the same time, the time dimension plays a key role. Language practices develop thought sequences of decisions over time and early configurations, especially in early childhood, shape later possibilities in ways that are not easily reversible. Taken together, this finding challenge simple models that link language proficiency directly to integration and belonging. Instead, they suggest that language operates as a domain of practice in which belonging is continuously negotiated and reconfigured in the family. The paper makes two main contributions. First, it presents language as a relational and time-based practice rather than as a measurable factor. Second, it identifies intra-family interaction as a key place for understanding how belonging is produced and explain variation across families with similar structural conditions. Finally, the findings suggest a broader implication for how identify is understood. Instead of seeing ethnic identity as a starting point, these analyses show that it should be understood as an outcome of ongoing processes. Identity doesn't come directly from language skills or cultural transmission, but from the organization of everyday life in the family, where language is one of the central, but not the only, domains in which belonging is produced. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very glad to be here with you.